Hello, welcome to Number 7 Ministries Christian Outreach. Today's short sermon is called Spiritual Vampires. God desperately wants the body of Christ, those that are covered under the blood of Christ, those that are born again, those that are Holy Ghost filled, those that are walking, talking, living, and breathing for Jesus Christ. He wants to teach us how to talk. He wants to teach us how to communicate. He wants to teach us when to communicate and when not to communicate. The devil knows that as children of God, we only have so much energy that God gives us each day. When you wake up, you don't have unlimited amount of energy. There are limitations to us in the natural. And so that is where Satan has room for victory, is if he can get us in the natural. If we're in the spiritual, the spirit never gets tired, but our flesh does. So that is what the devil is going to attack, is our flesh. And he wants to take us out of the Spirit of God and bring us into the flesh. And one of the ways that he does that is through spiritual vampirism. If you go onto the website of the Church of Satan cult, on their front page it says spiritual vampire. And I want to tell you, why do you believe that that's on their front page? If you had a website and you were going to advertise something on the front page, would it be the least important or the most important? Obviously, the answer is it's going to be the most important thing. You want everyone to see it. And the devil wants everyone to see one of his most important things, and that's training an army of spiritual vampires. There are wolves in sheep clothing that go out into the midst of the church and try to divide and conquer. And one of the ways that he does it is through spiritual vampires. And I want to tell you exactly what a spiritual vampire is. A spiritual vampire is someone who is aware or unaware of what they're doing. And what they want to do is engage in vain conversation. They want to argue with you. They want to ultimately take your energy, take your joy, and take your peace. And a Christian who's not being led by the Spirit of God will fall victim and prey to the spiritual vampires. Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. The Bible verse that I would like to read is Matthew chapter 15, verse 23. But he answered her not a word. And I really want to emphasize on that. Jesus Christ answered her not a word. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, Send her away, for she crieth after us. The next Bible verse is Matthew 26, verse 63. But Jesus held his peace. I want to emphasize on that too. Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Look at this. Jesus held his peace, and he answered not a word. As a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ, you do not need to know all the answers of all the questions. You do not need to know everything, and you don't need to have all the answers. As a pastor, I don't have all the answers. I don't know everything. What I do know is who knows everything. And as a Christian, it's our goal, it's our duty to point those who come to us to Jesus Christ. If you're drawing them unto yourself, then you're sinning against God. And Satan is fully aware of this. And what he's going to try to do is get us to have all the answers, or deceive us into thinking that we can have all the answers. He's going to provoke us. He's going to say things that cause Christians to become insecure about their faith. See, if a Christian has complete security about who they are in Christ, if a Christian has complete security about what they believe, then there is absolutely no room for the devil to come in and suck anything from them. And that's where God wants us to be, is completely secure in our faith, secure in who we are in him. But the thing is that we don't have to have all the answers. And remember, that spirit of spiritual vampirism It's alive today and it's taking place. And they're going to come into your life and they're going to try to draw you in debates about religion. They're going to draw you in debates about doctrines, about Bible verses. And in the end, it's going to be unprofitable. In the end, it's not going to edify you. It's not going to edify them. And ultimately, those who are operating under the spiritual vampires and demon, they don't care whether they're right or wrong. They don't even care about what they're talking about. All they care about is attacking you. And remember, like I said, some may not even be aware of that, of what they're doing. They might not even be aware that they're being used by a demon. Some people are spiritually blind and spiritually dead and just possessed by demons. And as a Christian, we need to be aware of what's taking place. We don't need to be caught up in our pride, because we can start off in a conversation with good intentions. We can start off in a conversation with trying to win them to Jesus Christ. And in doing that, we can be lifted up in pride. But see, if God is not leading you into that conversation, then He's leading you out of it, and you need to leave it. The next Bible verse that I would like to read is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. Be not deceived. Evil communication corrupts good manners. Have you ever been at work and you started off in a conversation with someone about something that was innocent, and by the end of the conversation, everyone was talking about fornication, adultery. They were talking about wicked things. But it started off innocent. See, that's not a coincidence. Those things happen on purpose. There are people that are going to be sent in your life by Satan, and they're going to start off in innocent conversations, but their goal is to get you corrupted. Their goal is to get you tempted. Their goal is to plant seeds of doubt in your life. The next Bible verse that I want to read is Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under your feet and turn again and rend you, which means rip you. And they're going to rip you of your peace, rip you of your joy, rip you of your faith, if you allow them to. And see, I believe baby Christians are often victims of the spiritual vampires. And the devil knows exactly what he's doing. He's shrewd and he's wise in his own wickedness and what he's trying to do. He knows our weaknesses sometimes more than we even know our own weaknesses. That's why we have to devote ourselves to the Word of God. That's why we need to stay spiritually connected to God daily. If you find yourself waking up full of joy and waking up full of peace and love, and then you communicate with someone, and all of a sudden you don't even know why you're angry, you're upset, you have no joy, and you have uneasiness. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that's a coincidence? Or do you think that that was a spiritual attack? I want to tell you it's not a coincidence. There is a reason why that happened. The next Bible verse that I want to read is Proverbs chapter 26, verse 5. Now look at this. This looks like this would be a contradiction. But what I said before in another video, if it looks like a contradiction, that is a red flag in an area for growth and to be able to learn, because God is not schizophrenic and He doesn't contradict Himself. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 5. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou be like unto him. What does that mean? Because every situation is different. You don't do the same thing all the time, or you're not being led by God. If you're being led by God, there's going to be a time where you're going to answer a fool according to his folly. There's going to be another time when you're being led by God when you're not going to answer a fool according to his folly. I do prison ministry. Let me throw this at you. If there's a guy in the jail and he's foaming at the mouth and he's 7'10" and he's 500 pounds full of muscle with veins popping out of his neck and he's screaming and yelling, am I going to answer him according to his folly? No. I'm going to answer him in a soft way, in a very kind, loving way. That's not wise to answer him like a fool, the way that he's being foolish. No, that would not be the right scenario. However, if there's someone sitting in the congregation and they're have their hands folded and then talking very softly, there might be a time where you're going to answer a fool according to a folly. You have to use wisdom in the things that you do. I pray that this message takes seed inside of your heart. It grows root and it flourishes and produces a lot of fruit. And that is how you know if someone is being led by God or if someone is a spiritual vampire, if they are bearing the fruit of God. God bless you and have a wonderful day.
Here is the story of Prince Vlad III, better known as Dracula. Vlad III was born in 1431 in the walled city of Zigishawara. This feudal city is in the heart of Transylvania. It was built after the terrifying Tatar invasion of 1241 to 1242. This is the house where Vlad III was born. In this room, you can see frescoes of the 15th century. We recognize his father, Vlad II Dracul, meaning Vlad II the Dragon. This is why Vlad III got his nickname, Dracula, the Little Dragon. In 1442, to secure the peace treaty with the Turks, the young prince Vlad III, who was 11, was sent to Adrianople as Sultan Murad II's hostage. There, he discovered impalement, which was very popular in the Ottoman Empire. 5 years later, in November 1447, his father, Vlad Dracul II, was brutally murdered by nobles and Saxon merchants in the marshes of Baltony. In 1448, Vlad III was 17. He was finally freed by the Sultan and returned to Transylvania, determined to avenge his father and brother who died tortured in Tarkovice. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople. It was the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Joan Corvin, the regent of Hungary, gave an army to Prince Vlad III to defend the southern Carpathians against the Turks. But Vlad III took this opportunity to overtake the throne of Wallachia by killing Prince Vladislav in a battle. Vlad III then decided to eliminate all the nobles who could challenge him. On Easter Sunday 1457, he arrested all the noble families that he had invited to a big party at his court. He killed some by impaling them and used others as slaves, forcing them to build a fortress on the ruins of an ancient outpost. This is the steep Ponari fortress, overlooking the Arges River on the southern flank of the Carpathians. The construction was to last for months, and many nobles were to die of exhaustion. He then impaled hundreds of thousands of men, and especially Saxon merchants of Basov and Sibiu, and also the Turkish prisoners. Vlad III became Vlad Tepes, meaning the impaler. Throughout the country, merchants distributed Little Prince, representing Vlad Tepes in the process of bleeding them. Here are edicts, signed by Vlad Tepes, dating from that era. In 1462, Vlad Tepes felt stronger and decided to break his alliance with the Turks. When emissaries came to collect tribute from the Sultan Mehmed II, Vlad Tepes ordered them to remove their turbans to salute him. When they refused, he nailed their turbans to their heads and returned them to their masters. Mehmed II, who was furious, sent his army and went after Vlad Tepes up to his Ponari fortress. The siege was terrible. The beloved wife of Vlad Tepes, who wanted to escape, fell to her death from the top of the cliff into the Arges River. Vlad Tepes, mad with grief, managed, however, to escape Ponari's siege and return to Transylvania to meet the Hungarian king Matthias Corvin, who was Joan Corvin's son. But because of his excesses, the king did not trust him and kept him prisoner in the Corvin castle for 12 years. In 1476, Vlad Tepes was again recognized as the Prince of Wallachia, as the country needed this excellent strategist and bloodthirsty warrior to defend its borders against the multiplicity of enemies. But he died beheaded in Bucharest in a battle against the Turks in December 1476. In 1897, the Irish writer Bram Stoker published the novel Dracula. It tells the story of a bloodthirsty vampire who lives in a castle in the Carpathians. This is the Bran Castle, located in the county of Brasov, on the northern slopes of the Carpathians. Bram Stoker's Dracula is directly inspired by the historical figure of Vlad Tepes Dracula, as it was represented on the Saxon merchant's Little Prince eating human flesh. But the literary character is based on the Strigois, these immortal ghosts of Romanian mythology emerging from graves to come and drink the blood of the living. From these two bloody sources was born the character of Dracula, the vampire whose tragic shadow has invaded our collective mind.
Cannibals, vampires, murderers who feed on humans.
There were so many murders in this case. They were so violent and gruesome.
Driven by desires and delusions.
You want to know what it is to be a vampire?
Where did their shocking crime? Vampires. Their acts have been called the ultimate taboo. They not only murder, but consume victims as well. Why do some killers cross the line into evil's darkest corners? In Germany, Armin Maives prowls internet chat rooms, hunting for a dinner guest. He eats the victim. Delusions tell Richard Chase he must consume human organs and blood, or he will die. His rampage claims 6. In Florida, Rod Farrell believes he is a vampire. His twisted fantasy takes the lives of 2 people. Fueled by delusion, fantasy, and even a desire for pleasure, these killers are propelled to commit evil acts. But not all killers are equal. What separates these killers and the fantasies that propel them? Now there is a scale with 22 levels that decodes a killer's motive, method, and mind. The more heinous the crime and the more rational the perpetrator, the higher the criminal is placed on the scale. Creator of the scale, Dr. Michael Stone, forensic psychiatrist from Columbia University.
Cannibalism and consuming human blood, that is, vampirism, awaken our most ancient and intense fears. These are not simple crimes of murder or violence. Rather, they are acts that violate all the boundaries between right and wrong that we have established as a society.
What is the source of these violent predators' darkest desires? And what causes some of them to be overtaken by madness and others to torture and kill for pleasure? To delve into the world of cannibalism, Dr. Stone starts with one of the world's most recent and notorious cases. The case of Armin Meiwes. – 2001, Germany. 41-year-old Armin Meiwes invites a man he met on the internet over for dinner. The meal will consist of red wine, fruit, and the main course will be the guest himself. Meiwes kills and dissects the victim. For the next few months, he will slowly consume him. Each meal is prepared with intricate care, savoring every bite with a carefully chosen wine. Why would someone not only kill, but also consume their victim? What is the motivation for such a grisly crime?
Cannibalism has always been considered the most gruesome of crimes, for it is a crime that transgresses against the most sacred rules for living as civilized creatures, that we do not tear the flesh, devour, and annihilate another human being.
1969. Armin Meiwes is a happy child. He spends his days playing with his two half-brothers and building model houses. But Armin's world crumbles. Shortly after his 6th birthday, his father leaves home, never to return. That same year, Armin's half-brothers abandon him to live with their biological father. Armin is devastated. He is left to live alone with his domineering mother. His days are now filled with joyless, menial tasks. Under the watchful eye of his mother, Meiwes is given endless chores around their dilapidated house. His mother refuses to let him play with neighborhood children. Though it is the 1970s, Armin is forced to wear traditional lederhosen to school. He is mocked by his classmates. Isolated, with few friends, Armin begins to develop disturbing habits. He spends hours dissecting dolls, taking them apart piece by piece, grilling their body parts. Armin is fascinated with the human body. He creates an imaginary brother. He begins to have fantasies about dissecting a body and eating human flesh. With time, his secret fantasy grows in intensity.
Meiwes gives a picture of violent desires, stretching back to his earliest years. The control and abuse exhibited by his mother, and his detachment from the world after his father and brother leave, push him toward an obsession with the only world where he can be happy, the world of fantasy.
As an adult, Meiwes' mother continues her controlling and abusive presence. She chaperones him on dates and insists on attending social functions as his escort. He is unable to form lasting relationships. His isolation drives him to look for companionship on the internet. His childhood fantasies of cannibalism take on a sexual tinge. He spends hours trolling the internet, looking for a young, physically fit man that he can not only have sex with, but also eat. In 1999, when Meiwes is 37, his mother dies. Free from his mother's controlling grip, his focus turns from a life of servitude to one of self-gratification. He posts advertisements on the internet for victims willing to let him eat them. The email address, anthropophagus, an ancient Greek term for cannibal.
Mive's fantasy world becomes all the more bizarre thanks to his isolation from his peers and his inability to form close attachments to anyone. To deal with this overwhelming loss, Mive seeks to restore that loss symbolically by taking into himself another person.
2 years after beginning his quest, Mives's fantasy starts to become reality. 43-year-old Bernd Brandes answers an internet posting. He offers himself to Mives with the simple phrase, "I hope you find me tasty." On March 9th, 2001, Bernd Brandes visits Armin Mives's house. He is a willing participant in Mives's fantasy. Mives feeds him a cocktail of sleeping pills and cough medicine. Brandes slips into unconsciousness. For Mives, it is the pinnacle of a lifelong fantasy. After a kiss, he stabs Brandes to death. He drains the blood out of the lifeless body. He intricately dissects and freezes 44 pounds of flesh, enough to satisfy his craving for several months. After he finishes Brandes's body, he goes looking for new victims. 5 months after killing Brandes, Mives posts a new ad. He wants another willing victim. He boasts of the slaughter on an internet chat room. A user contacts police. Mives is arrested. Police find the remains of Brandes and a videotape depicting the murder. The video is so disturbing, investigators seek psychological counseling for themselves. Mives is eventually convicted of murder, and in May of 2006 is sentenced to life in prison. Dr. Stone considers the crimes of Armin Mives.
Mives displays the signs of many fantasy-based egotistical killers. His lack of psychopathic tendencies and his rational demeanor before, during, and after the murder is what sets him apart. The bloodletting and dissection of Brandes would lead me to place Mives at level 14, but because the motivation of his crime is not to torture and mutilate his victim, and the fact that he sedated Brandes before killing to avoid inflicting pain, I place him lower on the scale. For these reasons, I would classify Armin Mives at level 7, highly egocentric murderers who kill for narcissistic reasons.
What are the roots of Armin Mives's desire to consume human flesh? Mives tells a courtroom that the impulse to eat another human being dates back to being abandoned by his father and brothers as a child. Is it possible that memories of traumatic events can be an ingredient in the twisted crimes of killers like Armin Mives? Science is now exploring the impact emotionally charged memories have on the brain. How can certain memories become more ingrained in the brain than others?
Although we do know that memories are very difficult to localize in the brain, it's something that has been sort of the holy grail of memory research.
Dr. Krista McIntyre of the School of Behavioral and Brain Science at the University of Texas at Dallas is trying to unlock the impact of memories on brain and social development.
I study the neurobiology of learning and memory, and I particularly focus on the consolidation of memories that are considered emotionally arousing.
In order to unravel the mysteries of the human brain, Dr. McIntyre starts with an animal brain. By examining the learned responses of rats, Dr. McIntyre hopes to answer questions about the origins of memory and the longevity and power of emotionally charged memories.
take a rat and place the rat in the light compartment of a two-compartment alleyway. So one compartment has a very bright light above it, and the other compartment is dark. And rats are nocturnal, and they tend to prefer the dark, so they'll enter the dark compartment fairly quickly, and we block them in there.
Inside the dark end of the alley, Dr. McIntyre stimulates the first group of rats with a mild electric shock. A second group of rats is also allowed to enter the dark section, but given no electric stimulation at all.
We take some animals, we put them in the light compartment, we allow them to enter the dark compartment, and they reach the end of the dark compartment and turn around, and then we just wait 10 seconds and return them to their home cage without giving them a foot shock.
After the initial test, both groups of rats are returned to the alley. Those that received no electrical stimulation quickly enter the dark. But the other group shows a very different result.
After the rat received a foot shock, we returned the rat to the light compartment, and we saw that he didn't enter the dark compartment. We saw that during the training, the rat entered the dark compartment fairly quickly after only a few seconds. But after the training, when we put the rat in the light compartment, he spent many minutes, and probably if we'd left him there would spend up to 10 minutes in the light compartment. So from that we infer that the rat has some memory of the unpleasant experience that he had in the dark compartment. So this change in behavior that we see as a result of experience is what we consider memory.
Dr. McIntyre's results seem to suggest that the rat assigns the darkness an unpleasant memory and alters its normal behavior. In this case, the mind of a rodent is similar to the mind of the human. Pinpointing how and why a traumatic experience impacts the brain in humans may lead to one day isolating and treating these memories.
There are many people who are suffering from intrusive memories that are so strong that they're haunting and debilitating. So ultimately we hope that this research will help us to better understand what's going wrong when memories are stored and they're too powerful and too intrusive.
If emotionally intense memories can have a prolonged impact on normal, healthy people, what might they do to those who show signs of aggressive behavior or psychopathy? For Andre Chikatilo, negative memories may have been part of the fuel that fired a psychotic mind. Soviet Union, 1940s. Andre Chikatilo's parents tell him that an older brother has been murdered and cannibalized during a famine. Chikatilo begins fantasizing about killing and eating people. His fantasies of consuming human flesh continue into adulthood. He finally succumbs to his desire. From 1978 to 1990, Chikatilo murders, mutilates, and in some cases cannibalizes 52 women and children. It is considered the most brutal crime spree in Soviet history. On February 15, 1994, Chikatilo is executed for his crimes. For the sheer volume of his atrocities and the brutality with which they were committed, Dr. Stone places Andre Chikatilo at number 22, the highest number on his scale. A troubling childhood memory, mental illness. These are some of the ingredients which may have driven Andre Chikatilo to murder and consume his victims. But the triggers of all cannibals are not as clear-cut. Experts wonder what drove Jeffrey Dahmer, America's most notorious cannibal. Does his murderous spree have roots in the dissolution of his family? Are memories of profound loneliness part of what drive him to kill? Milwaukee, 1978. At age 17, Dahmer's parents engage in a bitter divorce. Dahmer is left to live at home alone. Later that year, Dahmer picks up a hitchhiker and murders him. "I didn't want him to leave," he later explains. From 1978 to 1991, Dahmer's spree continues. He rapes, murders, and eats at least 15 men and boys. In some cases, he stores their remains in his refrigerator. By 1991, it is estimated that he is killing one person a week. It is not until one of his intended victims is able to escape that police discover the gruesome scene at Dahmer's apartment. Investigators uncover human remains, severed heads, and bodies decomposing in containers of acid. His total number of victims is unknown. Dahmer is sentenced to 937 years behind bars. After 2 years in prison, Dahmer is murdered by a fellow inmate. Dr. Stone reserves the highest place on his scale for Jeffrey Dahmer, for his elaborate and vicious acts of torture, rape, and murder. Like Andre Chikatilo, Jeffrey Dahmer receives a 22 on Dr. Stone's scale. Sacramento, 1978. A pregnant woman is savagely murdered in her home. Blood is drained from her body. 1 month later, 3 more people are discovered in a small home. Again, the bodies have been drained of blood. In some cases, organs are missing.
There were so many murders in this case. They were so violent and gruesome.
Police quickly pin the crimes on 27-year-old Richard Chase. He confesses to the crimes and tells investigators he had to do it. He believes he must drink the blood of others or he will die. His motive for murder? To quench a delusional thirst for blood.
To the general public, the actions of Richard Chase look like those of a madman. But in his delusional state, he has convinced himself that murder and consuming blood are a very matter of survival. To understand how he becomes so intertwined with his delusion, I must explore his past.
May 23, 1950. Richard Chase is born into an unhappy home in a middle-class neighborhood of Sacramento. His father is a disciplinarian, and his mother suffers from delusions. She accuses her husband of infidelity and spends hours crying. Both parents take their frustrations out on a young Richard. Chase's mother forces him to eat until he becomes violently ill. Richard begins acting out. He starts torturing and mutilating animals. He dismembers their bodies and buries the remains in the backyard.
Chase shows extreme signs of pathological behavior at an early age. His blatant abuse of animals is a key indication of a deep-rooted mental disturbance. His actions as a child are a precursor to extreme violent behavior in adulthood.
As an adult, Chase starts showing signs of mental illness. He abuses drugs, pushing him further into his delusions. He becomes deeply paranoid and believes people are out to harm him. Chase boards up the windows and doors of his apartment. He sees numerous psychiatrists without result. With no help in sight, Chase slowly spirals deeper into his isolated world of delusion and fantasy. Chase becomes convinced that he is being poisoned by both his mother and the Nazis. He believes the poison is dissolving the blood in his body. He begins to slaughter animals and drink their blood in order to replenish his own blood. It is a delusional attempt to sustain his own life. Fearing he will die, Chase injects rabbit's blood into his veins. He is admitted into a hospital. Doctors diagnose Chase as having schizophrenia and suffering from somatic delusions.
Somatic delusions focus on distortions relating to body functions, sensations, or one's physical appearance. Usually, these amount to the false belief that the sufferer is somehow diseased, abnormal, or changed. As for Richard Chase, he believes that he has been poisoned and that his blood is evaporating.
Less than 6 months later, Chase is released. Hospital psychologists believe he is no longer a danger to himself or the community. Within days of returning home, neighbors observe Chase bringing animals into his apartment. They are never seen again. Dissecting creatures and liquefying their organs no longer alleviates Chase's bloodlust. Even some hospital employees who treated and released Chase knew what he was capable of in his search for blood.
My belief was that Richard Chase now was doing things with small animals, you know, killing them, drinking their blood, and that he would graduate to larger animals and eventually to people.
Among Richard Chase's delusions are voices telling him he is diseased. He is convinced Nazis are poisoning him and that his blood is dissolving. He must consume blood in order to survive.
The depth of Chase's delusions, fueled by his abuse of mind-altering drugs, shows how wildly his schizophrenia-like illness had spiraled out of control. The delusions invaded every aspect of his life. Once he began to abuse the drugs, the swiftness of his mental deterioration accelerates like a runaway train.
But after consuming the blood and organs of animals, his delusions persist. Chase begins hunting for new sources of blood. Chase trolls neighborhoods, looking for his first human kill. December 29th, 1977. Without warning, Chase guns down a man in his front yard. Chase flees, unable to drink his victim's blood. Police do not link him to the murder until later. With voices compelling him to drink blood, Chase continues to prowl Sacramento, searching for more victims. 1 month later, police discover a gruesome scene. 3 mutilated bodies are discovered in a small Sacramento home within the vicinity of Chase's apartment. One victim is savagely dissected and drained of her blood. She also suffers a series of violent sexual assaults before and after her death. The grisly nature of the crime shocks even veteran officers. The FBI creates a profile: white male in his mid-20s, thin and undernourished. Police immediately receive several tips implicating Chase. Richard Chase is arrested. Chase is charged with 6 murders. The brutal nature of the crimes and the disturbing element of vampirism draws media outlets from across California. After several psychiatric reviews, Chase is found sane. While doctors believe schizophrenia fueled his delusions, the court determines that Chase could distinguish right from wrong. After a 4-month trial, Chase is found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. He is sentenced to death.
Chase's mental illness, one that resembled paranoid schizophrenia, led me to place him originally at level 13. But taking into consideration the violent sexual nature of his crimes, which probably would not have occurred but for the drug abuse, lead me to place him at a higher level, 17.
After less than a year in prison, Chase commits suicide by hoarding a lethal dose of his psychotherapeutic medication. Though Richard Chase was diagnosed as a schizophrenic, he didn't stay on his medication. His delusions go unchecked, delusions which are frighteningly real.
There's no question that to the person experiencing delusions, they are real.
Dr. Robert McCarley, director of the Neuroscience Laboratory of the Harvard Medical School, is trying to better understand the brains of schizophrenics. He hopes to learn how to better treat those whose delusions lead them to harm themselves or others.
Why do some patients become violent? Certainly not a majority or even a major part of the people with schizophrenia. If your brain is disordered enough to think that people are out pursuing you, then it seems reasonable, although illogical, for you to strike out at those people.
The majority of patients with schizophrenia are not violent, but in a few rare cases, like that of Richard Chase, their delusions can drive them to violent acts. What can science tell us about schizophrenic delusions? To better understand the mind of schizophrenics and determine why some have delusions that lead to violence, Dr. McCarley conducts an electrophysiological examination of the brain.
Subject comes in, they put a cap on his head which has 64 electrodes on it, and then we present stimuli to the subjects.
The patient is played a series of tones. Some of the tones are different than the others. The participant is asked to identify the oddball or different tones by responding with a mouse click.
The subject's brain on its own generates electrical potentials, brain waves, that make up the EEG.
Dr. McCarley has determined that the schizophrenic brain has a harder time distinguishing the different tones. The patient's brain waves also show that there is a specific area of the brain that processes these sounds.
One of the brain areas that's affected in schizophrenia is in the temporal lobe, and this is one of the main areas for processing language and for processing auditory information.
According to Dr. McCarley's research, the temporal lobe may be the source of auditory hallucinations. The patient's own mind creates the delusions and hallucinations. But why can some delusions lead to violence? Though more research is needed, Dr. McCarley has a theory.
Many patients with schizophrenia who abuse substances seem to be particularly prone to violence.
Eustis, Florida, November 1996. 17-year-old Jennifer Lynn Wendorf makes a shocking discovery.
I need 2 ambulances. My mother and my father have just been killed. I just walked in the door. I don't know what happened. They are dead.
The bodies of her parents have been bludgeoned beyond recognition. It is a grisly scene. Within days, police arrest a group of teens.
All of them members of a vampire cult.
The group's leader is a troubled and wayward 16-year-old Roderick Farrell. Without hesitation, he confesses to the brutal slayings. He shocks investigators with claims he is a vampire.
Vampire cult. Vampires in murder. They self-described.
Made the gruesome discovery shaken.
Thirsty for blood.
Rod, is it true that you're the leader of a cult? Is that true?
Vampire?
What drives Farrell to sadistically murder 2 people? Does he truly believe he is a vampire? Or is it part of a manipulative game?
Farrell's claims that he is a vampire suggest a deep connection to a world of fantasy where he is all-powerful. The drive to create such an environment for oneself is often nurtured through isolation and abuse at an early age.
1980, Florida. Roderick Farrell is born to a teenage mother. His father leaves her weeks later. Farrell grows up an outcast, moving from home to home. It is a childhood characterized by instability. Later, he claims that members of his family belong to a satanic cult and that he is exposed to brutal rituals and blood sacrifice. As a lonely teenager, Farrell takes refuge in a world of fantasy. He becomes obsessed with vampires, devouring novels and playing a vampire role-playing game. It is a fantasy which holds a special power for the boy. Farrell prowls cemeteries and tells others he is an ancient soul. Farrell spreads his vampire beliefs to a loose cadre of friends and hangers-on. Like him, they are misfits. They play at being vampires and perform rituals where they drink each other's blood. What starts as a refuge from the real world takes a dangerous turn. A friend and member of the teen's vampire clan, Heather Wendorf tells Farrell that she wants to break free from her parents. It is the spark that lights the fire. On November 25th, 1996, Farrell, along with members of his clan, travel to the Wendorf home. He breaks in and discovers Richard Wendorf, Heather's father, asleep in front of the television. Farrell strikes him with a crowbar over 20 times. Farrell then strikes and stabs Heather's mother to death. 3 days later, Farrell is arrested. He confesses to the murders and tells investigators that he derives an adrenaline rush from the killings.
It's clear that for Farrell, the refuge of fantasy has crossed over into the real world with dire consequences for all involved.
February 1998. The jury votes unanimously, giving Farrell the death penalty. The judge orders Farrell to the electric chair. His sentence is eventually commuted to life. Dr. Stone is on his way to meet Farrell at Union Prison in Rayford, Florida, where he is serving a life sentence. How much is Farrell willing to reveal about the true nature of his crimes?
Can you recapture your feeling state, your mind state at the time of the incident?
My thoughts and feelings at the time of the incident, in fact, for that entire time period during the course of that year, were perhaps more so elevated than your average individual, to the point that it's incomprehensible to someone that could not have been there themselves. You want to know what it is to be a vampire? It equates to the life, it equates to power. It equates to the very foundation of existence. It's the communion. It's the holy wafer on the tongue. And that is what blood is to a sanguinary vampire. That's what a sanguinary vampire is, a blood feeder.
How did your vampiric name come about?
When I was given the name, I was uncertain as to what it meant. But after much research and study, I had come to find that Visago was, in Goetic beliefs, the, I think, 9th crowned prince of hell. and his offices were seeing into the future and the past, the present, and finding things lost, so forth and so on. However, I think that that did more damage than good. Because many people have associated me with Satanism, and I have to say that although I hold nothing against the satanic beliefs or the people that practice them, I have personally never been involved in such activities or beliefs. Vampirism is not Satanism. They are two separate things.
Can you explain to me what feedings entailed?
Feedings, be it between vampires or between donors, usually consists of either biting, blades, perhaps syringes on occasion, and taking the blood from one individual to mingle it with another. It is one individual literally being trusted enough or loved enough to open that other person's flesh and seek out their most prized possession, the very core of themselves, which would be, in vampiric belief, their blood. At which point, ingesting it, taking that other person into themselves, shows, I suppose, a love for the other individual too, the victim. However, sometimes sanguinary vampires, the blood feeders, many times actually, will go beyond that belief and look at the fact that it's the core essence of a being. It's, for them, food. And sometimes, again, that can be taken out of context like many things can in pretty much anything in life.
And how does one become a sanguinary vampire? Is there a special ritual?
Crossing over, also known as the embrace, is the point where someone comes from the mundane society of being a regular individual and then is accepted into a vampiric family. It's much like a regular feeding. It's taking the blood of the one who is to come into the family and drinking it. You feed the person that is to enter into the family your blood. Their blood is effectively mingled into the family's blood. And at that point, the vampiric blood basically overtakes their being and they become part of the family. I embraced many individuals. Heather was among one that I allowed the embrace to take place on.
Do you have any thoughts now, looking back on your life, as to what may have nudged you in the direction of the bad side or the darker side?
I've had over a decade to reflect upon my entire life. I would have to say that the allure of the vampiric living can involve a compensation in sorts of perhaps people's pasts, individual hurts. It is a way not so much to mend the scars as to cover them for some.
I'm speaking about the things people said that happened to you, were done to you when you were very small.
By the Black Mass, which is a dark occultic group.
Even from your own grandfather is what I'm talking about.
I would rather not go into that, Doctor.
That's precisely my point.
There are many adults, far more than most people would expect out in your society, that do prey upon young individuals, and they rape them, they murder them, or in their case, sacrifice, and any other number of uncouth, callous, and preferably unmentioned things.
Are you still attracted to the life of vampirism?
Wow, that's a large question. The vampiric way of living is dark, seductive. In some cases, you do gain senses of power and power of being. There's just so much that drives that world, and it is a very... There is really no other word other than seductive world, because it's like your darkest fantasy, your deepest, most hidden heart's desire. That's what the world consists of a vampire. To know that you are, to some people, less than man, and to others perhaps more than man, is also a seduction. To become past the norm of existence, to push the envelope and break the boundaries. Vampirism plays its part in my life as it ever has.
It is impossible to determine whether Farrell truly believes in his claims of vampirism or not, but he continues to express an attraction for them more than 10 years after the crime. He shows little regard for the impact the crimes had on the families of the victims, nothing to say of the severity and brutality of the murders themselves. I place him at number 10 on my scale for egocentric, psychopathic killers.
Cannibals and vampires. Motivated by fantasy, desire, and delusions, these brutal murderers commit some of the most terrifying crimes. By uncovering the world of murderers who not only kill, but consume their victims, Dr. Stone is continuing his quest to understand and quantify those who are most evil.
In the terrifying world of monsters, all roads lead to the graveyard. For it is here that the werewolves prowl, the witches cast their evil spells, and the vampires rise from the dead. Or at least so they tell us. But where exactly do the legends end and the facts begin? I mean, are these simply wild tales from a fevered mind? Or do they have a basis in some horrible truth? Tonight, we'll search for the answers. The howl of a lone wolf is a haunting sound that can fill your imagination with fear. And it is fear of that wild animal that has sparked so many legends, one of which is the werewolf. In folklore, the werewolf is a person who literally has been transformed into a wolf, a real wolf. But when Hollywood got its hands on the legend, reality left the picture. What we got instead was a distraught actor having a bad hair day. And we learned that anyone, even an upstanding family man, could go to the wolves.
Duncan, darling, this is Helen. These men have promised not to harm you.
Now, if that wasn't scary enough, everyone in town would chase the poor creature into a murky swamp and then act surprised when they got attacked.
His throat.
And of course, everyone had their own theories about what was happening.
Whoever is bitten by a werewolf and lives becomes a werewolf himself.
Oh, don't hand me that. You're just wasting your time.
The wolf bit you, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, he did.
It was enough to make a good legend roll over and play dead. But the true legend of the man-eating, grave-robbing werewolf lives on. It's actually based on the behavior of real wolves. These animals are natural scavengers, and centuries ago, they often prowled cemeteries to feed on the bodies buried there. Remember, this was long before the dead were buried inside coffins 6 feet under. Of course, anyone seeing these animals in the light of the moon might easily have mistaken them for a monster. And the tales of what they saw grew into the myth of the werewolf.
In mythology and legend, the werewolf is associated with the nighttime, with savage behavior, with antisocial behavior. The werewolf is often thought to be a demon or to be a person who has become the puppet of demons.
Another common theory was that the devil might possess a real wolf and cause the wolf to wreak havoc.
In addition, there is ample evidence that from time immemorial, people have believed that they could transform themselves into wolves.
If you look at the folklore, there is nothing there about half-man, half-wolf creatures. Werewolves simply look like other wolves. They are not different. The only difference is that they are animated by the spirit of a witch or sorcerer of some kind.
Sometimes our worst fears can become another person's reality. Although it's unlikely that anyone can be physically transformed into a wolf, there have been cases of people who have mentally transformed themselves into wild animals. The term used to describe this rare psychiatric condition is lycanthropy.
Now, the word lycanthropy actually is related to Greek mythology. Zeus became enraged at the king of Lycaon, and he transformed him into a raging wolf. And so we get from lycanthropy. The whole idea of lycanthropy is someone appearing or thinking of themselves as a wolf. Approximately 20 years ago, while I was working on an inpatient psychiatric service, I discovered a case of schizophrenia, which in fact turned out to be a case of lycanthropy.
Hello, sorry I'm late. I am Dr. Rosenstock.
The first time I saw this particular individual, she appeared frightened, out of control. She was sitting in a chair, holding on to various pieces of furniture, trying to explain something that she just couldn't explain.
I have no fear.
My first impression was that we had a terribly psychotic woman. But what was most unusual was that this lady was having a very peculiar delusion, namely envisioning herself in the form of a wolf.
According to Dr. Rosenstock, the woman was too confused to describe her own behavior.
Don't.
But members of her family explained to him what had taken place at a recent family gathering.
She completely became overwhelmed by impulses that directed her to behave in a wolf-like fashion.
And that we're here as a family to share it.
She began to make noises, gnawing sounds, and snarling sounds, and growling sounds. She was being directed by forces completely out of her control. And this resulted in tremendous alarm among the family members. She was taken home and seemed to calm down for a while. It was later that she began to take on persistent animal-like qualities. She had terrible urges and terrible obsessions. When she would look into the mirror, instead of seeing her face, would see the face of a wolf.
The doctor met with his
How are
patient
you?
for psychiatric sessions every day during her stay in the hospital.
You've been taking your pills.
She would describe that she is starting to regress back into a wolf-like form, or that she would be engaged by a wolf-like delusion.
I'm afraid to look in the mirror.
What do you see when you look in the mirror?
It's not the wolf, it's just the eyes. The eyes are different.
She saw two eyes. One was different from the other. One was a very normal eye, and one was a very evil eye.
Dr. Rosenstock placed his patient in a secure therapeutic environment and prescribed antipsychotic medication for her.
At some point, when she was doing very much better, there were conversations about the wolf.
Fangs and everything was horrible.
I think the wolf represented for her evil incarnate, and she could see herself as a sinner. It's a very ironic issue. In reality, we shouldn't be that afraid of wolves. Unless they're starving or unless they're injured, they usually don't attack human beings. In fact, if they have an aberrant member of that community who might be threatening and break the rules of the pack, they actually destroy that particular member. People have a built-in fear of the wolf. We probably don't realize how we inculcate within our children the fear of a wolf. And in Three Pigs, who's afraid of the big bad wolf? All of a sudden, we're saying to our children, there's something very evil, something that can be life-threatening. We always say to the child, don't cry wolf, because one day you will and you won't be saved. We even use the expression, don't wolf down your food. And we're communicating, be careful lest you take on some type of animalistic quality.
And so we grow up fearing the wolf, hearing stories of grandmothers being eaten alive and crafty wolves disguised in sheep's clothing. And out of these tales comes the greatest fear of all, that we ourselves might actually turn into a wolf. But the legend of the werewolf remains just that, a legend, a figure of folklore, a real wolf animated by the spirit of a sorcerer or a witch. Still to come, witches. Are they wicked or just misunderstood?
We're not green. Most of us do not cackle, so therefore we're difficult to recognize.
Also, the real Dracula. He may be more frightening than you've ever imagined. Beware of witches, or so we're told. They're wicked, they're treacherous, they're deceitful, and they're also great fun. What would Halloween be without a witch? Or can you imagine Hansel and Gretel without one? All you'd have left is 2 kids and some breadcrumbs. And yet, the witch has been a source of ridicule for centuries. Folklore and legend have saddled her with very dark and sinister attributes. She's usually depicted as an ugly old hag with a wart on her nose. No wonder she stayed home until after dark. She'd emerge at midnight, the witching hour, riding her broomstick across the sky. Now, it may be difficult to imagine, but this had to be even more uncomfortable than flying coach. But there was a purpose to her discomfort. She could use the broom to sweep her tracks from the sky. Her fashion sense, however, was not as discreet. She took to wearing large pointed hats, a dead giveaway that she was evil. You see, in earlier times, this style of hat was frowned on by the church, which equated the point with the horn of a devil. So anyone wearing such a hat would, of course, be in league with the devil. In spite of all the negative stereotypes that folklore has heaped on the witch, there's a large and growing number of people today who are proud to call themselves witches. They practice a pagan religion called Wicca, from the Old English word for wise. Wiccan priestess Selena Fox explains.
Witchcraft is not only alive and well in the United States, but it is around the world. And by witchcraft, I mean the ancient nature religion. The word witch has a lot of baggage. One of the things that people think about when they hear the word witch is evil of some sort. We do not worship Satan. We don't believe in Satan. The idea of witchcraft and Satanism becoming synonymous is a result of the negative PR campaign that was done during the Middle Ages.
For several hundred years, a witch hysteria swept throughout Europe that cost thousands of innocent people their lives. It was a period in history the witches call the Burning Times.
It was the time where reason was thrown out the window. If someone happened to not be popular in a community, or if someone wanted their land, all one had to do was make an accusation that the person was a witch, and the trouble would begin for that person.
Once someone was accused, they went through a series of intense interrogations.
Woman, stand up.
Now tell me, Agnes, do you know John Bell?
Torture was commonly used during these interrogations. People were tortured until they either gave up or died.
You spin well. So, you must find the mark. You must find the mark.
And when they gave up, they were forced to sign confessions that they had participated in black witchcraft and devil worship.
Woman! I said, did you
People lost their lands. People would rot in prisons for years, were hung or stoned to death. People were burned alive at the stake.
Some claim the men and women burning the witches were actually saving the souls of the convicted sinners.
People that called themselves Christian did some very unchristian-like things. Instead of loving their neighbor as themselves, they exterminated their neighbors, all in the name of eradicating evil. Hundreds of thousands, and some say even millions of people died during this rampage.
All from the fear of witchcraft. But the hysteria wasn't confined to Europe alone. In 1692, it found its way across the Atlantic to the small settlement of Salem, Massachusetts. It began in a kitchen where some young girls and a cook were playing with magic.
What do you see?
What happened next is a mystery that ended in tragedy.
In January of 1692, a little girl named Betty Paris became ill. She was the daughter of the minister of Salem Village. Before long, her cousin, Abigail Williams, who lived in the house with her, became ill as well.
Doctor, what ails them?
Reverend Paris called in a doctor. The doctor examined the young girls and, having no medical explanation for their illness, declared that they had been bewitched.
The thing to do then was to find out who was doing the bewitching, punish those people, and all would be well.
At first, the girls refused to name the people who were supposedly bewitching them. But eventually, and most likely out of fear that their own experiments with magic would be discovered, the frightened youngsters began to name names.
Having committed sundry acts of witchcraft and sorcery.
And the Salem witch trials were off and running.
It was a time of terrible fear. because it was likely that if you defended somebody or spoke for somebody who was accused, you would be accused yourself. It was a time of great courage as well, because many of the people that were accused refused to confess to something that they hadn't done and went to their deaths with enormous dignity.
Confess now to God Almighty of your sins. You are a witch.
You are a liar. I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard.
Before it was over, 141 people would be arrested, and 20 would be put to death on what is now called Gallows Hill. Whether or not the people who died on Gallows Hill were actually witches will never be known. In fact, it's very possible there were no witches in Salem at all at that time. But the same can't be said about today, for Salem has become a mecca for witches, and one of the most visible is Laurie Cabot.
There are 4,000 witches in Salem today, and we do rituals on Gallows Hill. If someone stumbled upon our ritual in the forest, they might be frightened because not many people have seen a witch's ritual or understand that it's a nature religion.
A very important part of most witchcraft rituals is the creation of sacred space. This typically takes the form of casting a circle.
And we bless Mother Earth.
The witch's pointed hat represents the sacred circle in which rituals are done. There are certain basic tools that witches use. The pentacle, incense, often in a cauldron. The cauldron for witches throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and before was used as part of folk healing. The old wise women who did the healing for their villages also had brooms, and some say that during the burning times that the broom was a way of concealing the witch's staff that was used in the casting of magic circles.
I've cast spells just like other people pray.
And we raise the cone of power
to heal someone, to have someone have a prosperous life, for happiness.
And we bless.
I think many religions use their prayers and their magic to manipulate the world and people around them. That is harmful magic. We ask for clean air, clean water.
Witches do not cast evil spells. Witches do not try to control other people. Unfortunately, some people hear the word witch and immediately think the worst.
For many years, the image that came to mind was that they flew on brooms and they were frightening. But what we're trying to do is help people to understand us so they don't need to fear us ever again. The future of witchcraft is as strong and as endless as our ancient history. Witches will never disappear from the earth.
And the world is a far more interesting place with them in it. Now, vampires, on the other hand, might not be as sorely missed, especially if they're real. Find out right after this. Next, one man's incredible search for the real Dracula, plus modern-day vampires, murderers who have killed for blood. Our image of the classic vampire has been greatly influenced by Bram Stoker's Dracula. A black-caped count from Transylvania. A creature with fangs and a taste for blood. A monster that shuns the cross in the light of day. Diabolical fiend who can only be destroyed by a stake through the heart. Fortunately for us, Count Dracula is only a fictional character. Or is he? Could this symbol of the living dead, a man who sleeps in his coffin by day and searches for blood by night, could this vampire have actually existed? It's a question that captured the imagination of one man, Dr. Raymond McNally, an historian who re-examined Stoker's novel with a detective's eye.
I noticed that the places were real. Transylvania is real. It's part of Romania. Many people still think Transylvania is made up somehow. It's not made up, it's real. And I had this intuition that if the author went to such pains to be correct, impeccably so, about those places, I bet he based that figure that he has in that novel upon somebody who existed. So I started asking Hungarian scholars, was there anybody like Dracula? Does the name mean anything to you? Could there have been such a person? And I reached a complete dead end. I was told, you're a fool, you won't find out anything. This is all folklore, it's a vampire story made up by the wild imagination of this author, Bram Stoker. Forget about it.
But Dr. McNally couldn't forget about it. The prospect of discovering the real Dracula was too intriguing. And so, he learned Romanian, and in 1972, he received a Fulbright Fellowship. Dr. McNally was finally on his way to Transylvania to hunt for a vampire.
I went in search of the real Dracula, and he turned out to be an extremely interesting, very sadistic kind of person.
McNally discovered his first clue at a 15th century home in the ancient Romanian city of Sighișoara.
There's a plaque at the house that says that Vlad Dracul lived here from 1431 to 1436. The father's name was Vlad Dracul, from the Order of the Dragon. The son is Vlad Dracula. The A in Romanian is like son of, Dracul. So the connection with the Dracula that we know through the literature was clearly there. In the 15th century, this Dracula was a very well-known character. He was a horror figure already.
Armed with only a Super 8 movie camera, McNally followed the trail of Vlad Dracula through ransacked villages and desecrated monasteries. It was a bloody trail that eventually led him to the ruins of a medieval tower.
Cândia Tower is a tower at Târgoviște, which is the old capital of Romania in medieval times. Now, it is from that tower Dracula constructed a field called the Forest of the Impaled. Some 30,000 victims up on stakes and poles. Some of those victims had been up there for weeks. It's not a quick death. It's a terrible way to die. What is the purpose? That purpose is to show a lesson, a very powerful lesson.
Dr. McNally believes it was a graphic warning for the Turkish general Muhammad II, who was intent on destroying Dracula.
So the great conqueror, Muhammad II, when he came with his forces, outnumbering Dracula 3 to 1, but when he came to that field, the Forest of the Impaled, he said, what can you do against a man who does such terrible things? And he took his forces, and he went home.
Dr. McNally had indeed discovered a monster, a titled aristocrat and military leader named Dracula. But was this Dracula merely a ruthless killer? Or was he actually a vampire, someone who drank blood?
One of the new discoveries show that Dracula liked to dine amid his impaled victims. Can you believe that? The stench must have been excruciating. And we have woodcuts, contemporary woodcuts, showing that. Anyway, he gathered the blood from his victims in bowls, and then he took bread and he dipped it in the blood and slurped it down. So he was, by anybody's definition, a living vampire.
When we return, a psychological condition that might actually turn people into vampires. And an interview with a woman who claims to be one. Witches, Werewolves, and Vampires will return in a moment. Dr. McNally is convinced that he finally solved the mystery he'd read between the lines of Bram Stoker's novel, that the character of Dracula was based on a real person. But even if that's true, it isn't Vlad Dracula who springs to mind when you mention the word vampire. It's the character in books and movies that strikes terror in our hearts.
I believe that Dracula achieved his true immortality through the movies. And it's Nosferatu, that classic German movie. That's the best Dracula movie ever made, in my opinion. It launched the career of Dracula and made him immortal. Actually, the character in there looks like a vampire should look. It looks like the vampire of folklore, emaciated, ugly, disgusting in the extreme, and very, very scary. After all, it's a corpse. It's a walking corpse. It's been in the grave for a while. And that's the way it is in the folklore.
To understand the significance of this folklore, it's necessary to examine the attitude the medieval world held regarding death.
The assumption was that death came from the dead. In other words, if one person died and then a whole bunch of other people died, people assumed that the first person had brought death to the others. And typically what they did was dig up the corpse of the first person and inspect it for evidence that it was a vampire. For example, they would discover that the corpse would often have blood at its lips. The conclusion that they drew was that the reason why the corpse had blood at its lips and was larger than it had been was that it had been drinking the blood of the living.
Modern forensic science has provided a more rational explanation for this phenomenon. As a dead body decomposes, it creates gases which build up pressure in the lungs, forcing blood up through the mouth and onto the lips of the corpse. But without this medical knowledge, it's easy to understand how this natural process could be misinterpreted. And according to Dr. McNally, these superstitions and legends of the living dead survive in parts of Eastern Europe even today.
People in Transylvania still believe passionately in vampires, even though most of them have never seen a Dracula movie and they've never read the novel. I'll give you one example. When I was traveling, I met a girl whose father was a vampire. Yes, Tinka, her name. I said, "What do you mean your father was a vampire?" She said, "When he died, he was laid out to rest, and after 3 days they noticed rigor mortis had not set in. The skin was still pliable. Cheeks bore a ruddy complexion. These are the signs of the vampire in that part of the world, the undead." So she told me she couldn't do what had to be done because it was the body of her own father. But the villagers did, and they did what is done in the horror movies. They took a wooden stake and they plunged it through the heart of the corpse, keep it from walking. Got to drive it through the body and into the ground underneath the corpse. That's what pins it to the earth.
The Legends surrounding the vampire have provided terrified villagers with additional methods to protect themselves against the myth of the living dead. One of their folk remedies came from the notion that anything already dead and buried probably wouldn't have an especially pleasant odor when it came back to life.
Vampires were known to have themselves a very strong smell. And there's an old expression in Latin, similia similiis curantur. Similar things are cured by similar things. This belief caused people to feel that if the vampire has a strong smell, then what you should do to ward the vampire off is to put things that have strong smells around you. Garlic would typically be hung up in areas where vampires could enter. For example, you might hang garlic around the windows. Other things that ward off vampires are anything that's sharp. So people would put knives under their pillows or to embroider roses around any opening in the clothing. And the assumption there is that roses have thorns, vampires don't like things that are sharp, and therefore these things will keep away the vampires.
While men like Dr. McNally and Paul Barber explored the myth in the vampire fiction and folklore and history, other experts turned their attention to the psychological and criminal side of vampirism. What they discovered, if true, is both fascinating and terrifying.
Researchers nowadays believe that in addition to the vampire as a figure of myth and legend, there are certain conditions that actually lead to people developing the craving to drink human blood. Now, when I'm talking about vampires in the modern context, obviously I'm not talking about people who are transforming themselves into bats. At least I've never seen it. What I'm talking about are people who develop the compulsion to drink human blood. There's a typical pattern in the evolution of this condition that's been dubbed Renfield syndrome, named after the blood-drinking psychotic character in Bram Stoker's Dracula. The first stage generally begins in childhood. Some kind of critical incident occurs where the young person, boy or girl, but usually a boy, discovers that drinking blood can be exciting. This can lead to a second stage of what is known as auto-vampirism, or the lust for one's own blood. That then can evolve to a third stage known as zoophagia. This involves the consumption of non-human animals in order to drink their blood. So watch out for your dogs and cats in the neighborhood. Vampires at this stage might grab pets. The most advanced stage of Renfield's syndrome is true vampirism, which involves the drinking of the blood of other human beings. Some people who have reached this stage sneak into hospitals and blood banks and try and steal blood from the storage there. This stage of Renfield's syndrome can develop into serial murder. These people actually take blood involuntarily from other human beings. I think the most notorious case in modern times of a serial murderer who apparently had Renfield syndrome, clinical vampirism, was the Hague case.
During the late 1940s, English newspapers recounted the bizarre tale of John George Hague,
and you'll understand
a dapper gentleman who became known as the London Vampire. Hague's victims were his friends, people who trusted him.
Don't go far.
He would lure them to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town.
John?
They thought they were going to visit his place of business.
I can't see anything.
They didn't know they were going to their debts.
I'm getting the light.
Oh, John, do hurry. I really can't see.
Hague killed his victims quickly, usually with a gunshot to the back of the head. Reports suggest that Hague's obsession with blood began as a child. His parents frequently beat him, and one day, while being struck with a hairbrush, The bristles drew blood. He sucked the wound and enjoyed the taste. Like a classic case of Renfield syndrome, eventually his own blood couldn't satisfy him, and Haig began killing for a fresh supply. In addition to their blood, he also robbed his victims of their personal possessions, even going so far as to forge their names to gain access to their property. Haig confessed to killing 9 people over a period of several years before he was finally captured and convicted. John George Haig was executed for murder in 1949. Coming up, she sleeps in a coffin and drinks blood, but is she a vampire? The strange case of the London vampire sent shockwaves around the world nearly half a century ago. John George Haig is not the only person considered to be a modern-day clinical vampire. Unfortunately, during the last 20 years, there have been numerous reports of other people who were so psychologically damaged, so criminally insane, that they actually acted upon the impulse to commit murder for blood. New York, 1975. A woman is arrested for a grisly homicide that involved the siphoning of the victim's blood. California, 1978. Richard Trenton Chase is convicted of multiple murder, including at least 1 count of vampirism. His crimes earn him the nickname the Vampire Killer. Massachusetts, 1980. A young man with a history of mental illness hears a voice that tells him to use bullets painted gold to kill for blood. Only then will he be able to become a vampire. Florida, 1985. A 19-year-old woman accepts a ride from a man named John Brennan Crutchley, a successful high-tech engineer, who, after his capture, is dubbed the Vampire Rapist. Minnesota, 1988. After watching a modern vampire film, 3 teenagers decide to act out a similar scenario. They confront a 30-year-old vagrant who is unable to defend himself from their attack.
Fascination with blood, and even with drinking blood, is not restricted to serious psychiatric cases. My sense is that there probably have always been people involved in this. And the reason is that the sight of blood is, I believe, naturally exciting. Why is it that traffic slows almost to a stop whenever there's an accident? Because people slow down and they're looking for the red stuff. That orientation toward blood may well be programmed in the human being, because in the settings within which our species evolved, the sight of spilled blood indicates danger, indicates the presence of threat. Now, one of the properties of our species is that we can convert one type of physiological arousal, one type of being excited and turned on, into another type. For example, when we watch a horror movie, what is going on is that we're deliberately putting ourselves into a situation when we see monsters and often a lot of blood. We are being aroused by the fear stimuli, pressing those natural buttons inside ourselves. Another part of our mind, of course, knows that we're in a theater and we're safe. So we can convert the arousal of fear into the arousal of having a good time in a movie theater. So I think it's important, even though it may be kind of comforting, to distance ourselves from vampirism. I think perhaps it's not fully honest. I think that potentially there may be a vampire in all of us.
If not in all of us, there is a potential vampire in at least a small subculture of our society. People who believe, or say they believe, that they are vampires. I want you to meet Katrina Coffin.
I believe I'm a vampire because I do like the taste of blood, and I am nocturnal. I have a casket in my living room, and I do sleep in that. So if I've been up all night and the sun is coming up, I do not like the sun, and I can get into my casket, close the lid, and that way I don't have to deal with the sun or noise, and it's very comfortable and it's easy to sleep in. I drive a 1968 Cadillac hearse. I have a coffin in the back of my car for decoration. I'm very into the macabre. I have a lot of horror memorabilia around my house, and bats and rats and skulls and such. I have quite a few exotic animals. I like snakes, and I have a couple of tarantulas and a scorpion. I love the theatrics of vampirism. I like wearing the dark makeup. I like long fingernails. These are my real nails. And I've always been this way. When I was a child, if a friend of mine would fall and cut themselves, I would take the blood from the wound, and kids were kind of fascinated by it. They thought it was interesting. I don't bite people in the neck. Biting just leaves bruises. It doesn't draw blood. I don't need blood to survive, whereas someone like Dracula would have to have blood. I don't like the sun, but I won't disintegrate if I go out in it. I think there could be somewhere vampires that really are immortal, that live forever, need blood to survive. It's possible. There are ghosts and all types of other things, so anything is possible.
In every major city, I suspect that you could find interest in drinking blood, and I wouldn't necessarily want to say that that's the same thing as a psychiatric disorder. Having said that, however, a word of advice, drinking blood from your partner is not a safe sex practice. So I think a health advisory, don't bite your friends. You could acquire dangerous diseases.
Witches, werewolves, and vampires. Are they real? Well, as we've discovered tonight, that's a question that has no easy answer. The myths and legends of these creatures have been handed down through time. They were created by people who needed to put a face on their fears, to find answers to mysteries that have no explanation, and to evaluate the good in their lives against a specter of evil. Today, we no longer need these mythological monsters to explain the evil in our world, but the fascination with them lives on. People of all ages continue to thrill to a good horror story. As long as the sun sets, the moon rises, and night turns the sky to black, witches will fly on their broomsticks, werewolves will howl at the moon, and vampires will rise from their graves. And we will be there enjoying every moment of danger and suspense. Thank you for joining me tonight on our search for the unexplained. I'm Peter Graves. Good night.
Lock it. Now that caps off a crazy adventure.
Ben,
Did you?
get your window.
He's coming in the house. dog-like creature peeked its nose out. Now I'm going to see what it would have to stand on how tall it would have to be. Well, this is my height. There's the window. There's nothing it could have stood on. You know, that's weird, there's scratches on there. Well, anyways, it could have had a couple legs like this on these steps. But it would have to be about a foot taller than me in order for its head to peek out. Stating that the dog man would be, believe it or not, 7 foot tall on his hind legs. Did you? Oh! Did you? Oh!
Star Emergency. This is Kyle speaking. How can I help you? Hello?
Something just ran in front of us on the road. We're in the ditch. We rolled over.
How many people are in the car, and is anyone injured?
There's 2 of us. I don't think we have any injuries.
Is the car on its top or wheels or what?
No, it's kind of sitting on its side.
Hold one moment, please, while I contact emergency services.
Okay.
Okay, the state police should be on their way in a few minutes. Is everyone still okay?
Yeah, I think we're okay.
What ran in front of you? A deer?
I don't know what the hell it was, but it was big. It looked like a great big dog. Standing up.
Was it a bear, maybe?
Maybe. Oh my God. Oh my God!
Sir? Hello? Are you still there? Sir?
And somewhere in the Northwoods darkness, a creature walks upright. And the best advice you may ever get is don't go out at night.
Viele Geschichten und Legenden und Mythen die Beteiligung der Nazis in der Erforschung des Okkulten und des Paranormalen während der Hitlerzeit. Die meisten werden als bloße Übertreibung des grausamen Vorgehens der Deutschen zur Zeit des Holocaust angesehen. Und es bestehen immer noch wenige Hinweise dazu, aber es gibt ein Belegstück, wofür Theoretiker einen echten Beweis für genau diese Aktivitäten halten und das bis zum heutigen Tag Anlass der Kontroverse bleibt. Dieser Film wurde in der Region Schwarzwald im späten Herbst 1943 gedreht und ist seitdem eine der meiststudierten visuellen Dokumente des 20. Jahrhunderts geworden. Eine Gruppe deutscher Infanterie, die damit beauftragt wurde, die südlichen Grenzen des Vaterlandes zu festigen, hat etwas Außergewöhnliches begegnet. Der verstümmelte Körper eines ungenannten Lebewesens. Das Filmmaterial zeigt mehrere Infanteristen, die neben dem Geschöpf, der bewegungslos auf dem Boden liegt, posieren. Es sind keine Lebenszeichen. Mehrfache Verletzungen, die vermutlich Kugelwunden sind auf dem Körper der Kreatur zu sehen. Wer sind die Männer in diesem Film? Keine offiziellen militärischen oder biologischen Akten existieren. Es kann sein, dass zunehmende Drohungen von der sowjetischen Armee und die ganz echte Möglichkeit eines alliierten Vorrücken vom Westen zu diesem Zeitpunkt der Grund für diesen Mangel an Beweis sei. Aufgrund kürzlichen Fortschritte in DNS-Testen hat die Regierung beschlossen, die sterblichen Überreste des Remus-Skelettes, die immer noch im Berliner Museum für Naturkunde ausgestellt sind, neu zu veranlagen. Auf dem Schaukasten steht der Untertitel Remus-Monster, Deutschland, aus den manipulierten Knochen eines Wolfes.